The wind cut through Alina Whitmore like a blade made of ice, and she pressed a trembling hand against her swollen belly as she stumbled through the snow. Her breath came out in short white clouds, and her legs, weak from hours of walking, threatened to give out beneath her at any moment. Behind her, the small house she had once called home stood dark and empty, its door locked forever against her. Ahead of her lay only white fields and a road she barely recognized under the storm. 3 days ago she had been a wife. Now she was a widow, carrying a child who would never meet his father, and she had nowhere left to go. Her husband, Julian, had died suddenly, his heart failing him in his sleep, and within hours of his burial, his family had turned on her. His mother had called her a burden. His brothers had said the child she carried was not their concern. They had given her one night to pack her belongings before the house, which had always technically belonged to Julian's family, was taken back. Alina had begged them to reconsider, reminding them that she was carrying their own blood, but their faces had remained cold as the winter outside. She had no parents to return to. Her mother had passed years earlier, and her father had vanished from her life before she could even remember his face. She had no siblings, no close friends wealthy enough to take her in, and no savings that would last more than a week. She was, in every sense of the word, alone. But there was one name. Julian had told her the secret only once, late at night, in a moment of quiet vulnerability that she now clung to like a lifeline. He had said that his real father was not the man who raised him, but a nobleman of great standing, a duke who lived many miles from their small town. Julian had never confirmed it publicly, afraid of what it might do to the family that had raised him, but he had shown her an old photograph once, a faded picture of a young man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the portraits hanging in a manor gate they had once passed together during a trip. At the time, she had thought it was simply a story, a piece of family gossip passed down without real weight. Now, with nothing left to lose, it was the only thread she had to hold on to. She had asked around in the town before leaving and had been told, with some hesitation, that the Duke in question, a man named Nathaniel Ashford, lived in a grand estate on the far edge of the county. It was a journey that would take most of a day by carriage, but Alina had no carriage, no money for one, and no choice but to walk. The snow had started lightly that morning, and she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that she could reach the estate before the worst of the weather arrived. She had been wrong. By midday, the sky had turned a heavy gray, and by the time the sun began its early winter descent, the snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. Her shoes, thin and worn, had long since soaked through. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and her lips had turned a pale shade of blue that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She kept one hand pressed to her belly the entire time, whispering soft, broken reassurances to the child inside her, promises that she barely believed herself. "We're almost there," she murmured, though she had no real way of knowing if that was true. "Just a little further, my love, just a little further." The road stretched on, empty and unforgiving. Twice she nearly turned back, convinced that she had taken a wrong path, that the estate she sought was nothing more than a story told by a dying man's imagination. But each time, something inside her refused to give up. She thought of her husband's voice, low and certain, the night he had shown her that photograph. She thought of the life growing inside her, a life that deserved more than a mother who quit at the first sign of hardship. By the time the tall iron gates finally rose out of the swirling snow like the bones of some great sleeping beast, Alina was shaking so violently that she could barely keep her footing. The estate beyond the gates was enormous, its stone walls disappearing into the storm, its windows glowing faintly with warm light that seemed impossibly distant. She stumbled the last few steps toward the gate and gripped the cold iron bars with both hands, as if letting go might mean falling into the snow forever. "Please," she called out, her voice raw and cracked. "Please, is anyone there? I need help." For a long moment there was no answer. The wind howled around her, and she began to wonder if the house was abandoned, if she had walked all this way for nothing. Then, through the snow, she saw a figure approaching from the direction of the main house, wrapped in a heavy coat, moving with the brisk, unhurried steps of someone who had not yet noticed the urgency of her situation. The man stopped several feet from the gate and studied her with narrowed eyes. He was older, with a stern face and gray hair peeking out from beneath his hat. His expression was not unkind, but it was far from welcoming. "This is private property," he said. "You cannot be here." "Please," Alina said again, gripping the gate tighter. "I need to see the Duke." "It's a matter of great importance. I would not have come all this way if it were not." The man's eyes flicked briefly to her belly, visible even beneath her heavy coat, and something like suspicion crossed his features. "The Duke does not receive unannounced visitors," he said. "Especially not those who arrive on foot, in a storm, with no invitation and no name he would recognize." "My name is Alina Whitmore," she said quickly. "My husband was Julian Ashford, though he was raised under a different name. Please, if you would just tell the Duke." "I have heard many stories," the man interrupted, his voice hardening. "Women arriving at grand houses claiming connections to wealthy families is not a new tale. I am sorry for your circumstances, truly, but I cannot let you inside on nothing more than a name." "I am not lying," Alina said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I have nowhere else to go. Please, I am begging you. If not for me, then for the child I am carrying." The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment Alina thought she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but then he shook his head, pulling his coat tighter around himself against the cold. "I will inform the household of your presence," he said, though his tone suggested this was more a courtesy than a promise. "But I cannot open these gates without proper authorization. You will have to wait." "Wait where?" Alina asked, her voice trembling. "It is freezing. I cannot stand out here much longer." The man did not answer. He turned and walked back toward the house, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the snow, leaving Alina alone at the gate with nothing but the storm and her own fading strength. She waited. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The cold had become a living thing, wrapping itself around her bones, squeezing the warmth from her body one breath at a time. She tried to keep moving, shifting her weight from foot to foot, rubbing her hands together, but nothing seemed to help. Her vision began to blur at the edges, and a strange heaviness settled into her limbs, a heaviness that frightened her because some distant part of her mind recognized it as dangerous. She thought of Julian, of his warm smile and the way he used to hold her hand when she was afraid. She thought of the home they had once shared, small but filled with laughter, and the plans they had made for their child's future. All of it felt impossibly far away now, as distant as the warm lights glowing behind the estate's windows. "Please," she whispered, though there was no one left to hear her. "Please, someone help us." Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the iron gate, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the cold metal beneath them. She slid slowly downward, her back scraping against the bars, until she was kneeling in the snow, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The world around her began to fade, the storm and the estate and the distant lights blurring together into a soft, gray haze. She thought in some detached and frightened corner of her mind that this might be the end, that she and her unborn child might simply disappear into the snow, forgotten and unclaimed. She had never imagined her life could unravel so completely in the span of a single week. Only days earlier, she had been arranging small clothes in a wooden drawer, humming softly to herself as she imagined the child who would soon wear them. Julian had been alive then, teasing her gently about how she hummed the same 3 songs over and over, promising her that once the baby arrived, their little house would never be quiet again. She had laughed at the memory even as tears froze against her cheeks now, the contrast between that warmth and this cold almost more than she could bear. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to remember that panic would not help her or the child she carried. She thought instead of small, practical things, the way Julian had once taught her to do whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. "Count your breaths," he used to say. "Name 5 things you can see. Focus on what is real, not what frightens you." 5 things, she told herself weakly. The gate, the snow, the lights in the distance, the sound of her own heartbeat, the shape of her hands still gripping the iron bars though she could no longer feel them. It was not enough. The cold had moved past discomfort and into something far more dangerous, a heaviness that made her eyelids feel impossibly heavy, that made the idea of simply resting for a moment in the snow seem almost pleasant. She recognized, somewhere beneath the fog settling over her thoughts, that this was exactly the kind of thinking that killed people in storms like this one, and she fought against it with everything she had left. She thought of her child, of the tiny movements she had felt just that morning, small flutters of life that had once filled her with hope and now filled her with a desperate, aching fear. She could not let this be the end. She would not let the storm take what little she had left. "Please," she whispered again, though her voice had grown so faint she barely heard it herself. "Please, someone." The steward who had spoken with her earlier had vanished into the house, and though she strained her eyes toward the windows, she could see no sign of movement, no indication that anyone inside had any urgency about her situation. She wondered, in a moment of bitter clarity, whether the household had simply decided to wait out the storm and deal with her, if at all, once the weather cleared. She wondered if she would still be alive when that happened. Her fingers, wrapped around the iron bars, had long since lost all feeling, and she found herself unable to tell whether she was still gripping the gate or whether her hands had simply frozen in place around it. The world had narrowed to a small, gray tunnel, the storm pressing in from every side, the warm lights of the estate flickering like distant stars that offered no real warmth at all. She sank lower, her knees pressing into the snow, the cold seeping through her thin dress with a persistence that felt almost cruel. She thought, distantly, that she should call out again, that she should not give up so easily, but her voice would not obey her, and her body had begun to feel disconnected from her mind, as though she were watching herself from somewhere far away. It was in that moment, teetering on the edge of consciousness, that she heard it. The unmistakable rhythm of horses' hooves against packed snow, growing louder, closer, accompanied by the creak and rattle of carriage wheels cutting through the storm. She tried to lift her head, tried to call out, but her body refused to respond, and all she could do was remain there, slumped against the gate, as the sound grew nearer and nearer. A voice cut through the wind, sharp with alarm, ordering the carriage to stop. She heard the heavy thud of boots hitting snow, the quick, urgent footsteps of someone running toward her, and then, as her vision began to fade entirely into darkness, she felt strong hands catching her before she could collapse completely into the snow. The last thing she registered, before the world slipped away entirely, was a man's voice, low and disbelieving, murmuring words she could not quite make out, and the strange, overwhelming sensation that somehow, impossibly, she had been seen. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of the estate that stretched across the snow-covered hills, had not expected his carriage ride home to end with a stranger collapsed against his front gate. He had been returning from a long and tedious meeting with a neighboring landowner, his mind occupied with matters of business and the growing storm that had slowed his journey considerably. When his driver suddenly called out and pulled the horses to a sharp stop, Nathaniel had assumed some obstruction had fallen across the road, perhaps a broken tree branch or a stray animal caught in the weather. He had not expected to see a young woman, heavily pregnant, slumped against the iron bars of his own gate, her body dangerously still against the white snow. He was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, his heavy coat forgotten in his haste, and he crossed the distance to her in a matter of seconds. Up close, the sight of her was even more alarming. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, her skin was pale as the snow surrounding her, and her breathing, when he pressed his fingers gently against her wrist to check for a pulse, was shallow and uneven. "Get her inside now," he barked at his driver, his voice carrying an urgency that startled even himself. He gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her condition, and carried her toward the house as quickly as the icy ground would allow. It was as he shifted her weight against his chest that he noticed something clutched in her frozen fingers, something small and metallic that had slipped partway out of her coat pocket during her collapse. He caught only a brief glimpse of it, a flash of tarnished silver, but something about its shape sent an unexpected jolt through him, a strange and unwelcome sense of familiarity that he could not immediately place. He pushed the thought aside for the moment, focusing instead on getting the woman to safety. He shouted orders as he entered the grand foyer of his home, calling for blankets, for the household physician, for anyone who could help warm her frozen body before it was too late. The staff, startled by his uncharacteristic urgency, scrambled to obey, and within minutes, Alina had been laid upon a couch near a roaring fire, wrapped in thick blankets while the physician checked her vital signs with careful, practiced hands. "She is severely chilled," the physician said after a tense examination, "but her heartbeat is strong and so, it seems, is the child's. She was fortunate that you found her when you did, Your Grace." Another half-hour in that cold, and I fear the outcome would have been very different. Nathaniel nodded, though his attention had drifted back to the small object he had glimpsed in her hand earlier. He asked one of the maids to retrieve it carefully from where it had fallen near the couch, and when it was placed in his palm, his breath caught in his throat. It was a locket, old and worn, its silver surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the delicate engraving he remembered so clearly. He had given this exact locket, or one identical to it in every detail, to a woman he had loved many years ago, a woman his family had forced him to abandon before their relationship could ever become what it might have been. He had not seen this locket in over 30 years. He had believed it lost forever, along with the woman who had once worn it. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing the small portrait inside, faded but still recognizable. It was her, Isabelle, the woman he had loved and lost decades ago, the woman his family had deemed unsuitable for a man of his standing, the woman he had never been permitted to see again after their final, heartbreaking goodbye. He had never known what became of her after their separation. He had heard rumors over the years, whispers that she had married, that she had moved away, that she had perhaps even passed away, though nothing had ever been confirmed. He had spent decades wondering, in quiet moments he rarely allowed himself, what might have happened to the life they could have built together. And now, impossibly, her locket had appeared in the hands of a woman collapsed at his gate. He looked toward Alina, still unconscious on the couch, her face peaceful despite the ordeal she had just survived, and a dozen questions flooded his mind at once. How had she come to possess this locket? What connection could she possibly have to Isabelle? And why, of all places, had she come to his gate in the middle of a storm in her condition, seeking him specifically? He remembered, faintly, the words the steward had relayed to him earlier, before he had even seen the woman himself. Grayson had mentioned a name, hadn't he, something about a claim of connection to the family. Nathaniel had dismissed it at the time, as the kind of story that occasionally surfaced among opportunists, hoping to profit from his wealth and standing. He was ashamed now of how quickly he had been prepared to turn her away without a second thought. "Your Grace," Grayson's voice came from the doorway, hesitant and uncertain. "I apologize for not informing you sooner of her arrival. I did not realize the severity of the situation, and I believed her claims to be—" "What did she say her name was?" Nathaniel interrupted, his voice sharper than he intended. "Alina, Your Grace, Alina Whitmore. She said her late husband was named Julian, and that he had been raised under a different family name, though she claimed he was your son." The word struck Nathaniel like a physical blow. He had no children, or so he had always believed. He had never married, choosing instead to devote his life entirely to the responsibilities of his title after Isabelle had been taken from him. He had assumed, all these years, that he would be the last of his direct line, his title eventually passing to a distant cousin's family. But if Isabelle had been carrying his child when their families forced them apart, if she had given birth to a son, and raised him under another name to protect him from the scandal that would have followed such a revelation, then everything he believed about his own life was built on an incomplete truth. "Leave us," he said quietly to Grayson, and the other staff members still lingering in the room. "I wish to be alone with her when she wakes." The room emptied slowly, the physician offering a final assurance that Alina's condition, while serious, was stabilizing, and that she would likely regain consciousness within the hour. Nathaniel settled into a chair beside the couch, the locket still clutched tightly in his hand, and waited. The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed, and Nathaniel found his mind drifting back through the decades to a summer he had spent believing, foolishly perhaps, that love could overcome the rigid expectations of his family and his title. He remembered Isabel's laughter, bright and unrestrained, the way she used to tease him for being too serious, too consumed by duty. He remembered the day his father had informed him, in cold and unyielding terms, that their relationship would end immediately, that Isabel was not fit to be his wife, and that any further contact between them would result in consequences neither of them could afford. He had been young then and afraid, and he had allowed his family to dictate the course of his life without ever truly fighting for the woman he loved. It was a decision he had regretted every single day since, though he had told himself over the years that there was nothing to be done about it now, that the past could not be undone. But here, lying unconscious before him, was proof that the past had never truly left him at all. He studied Alina's face carefully in the firelight, searching for any resemblance to Isabel, any feature that might confirm what he was beginning to suspect. It was difficult to say with certainty, given the woman's exhaustion and the shadows cast by the flames, but there was something in the shape of her eyes, something familiar that he could not quite place. More than an hour passed before Alina finally began to stir, her eyelids fluttering weakly as consciousness slowly returned to her. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding with an anxiety he had not felt in decades, uncertain of what he would say to her, uncertain of what truth was about to unfold between them. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, taking in the unfamiliar room, the warm fire, the blankets wrapped around her. Confusion flickered across her features, followed quickly by alarm as she struggled to sit up, her hand immediately moving to her belly in a protective, instinctive gesture. "Please do not be afraid," Nathaniel said gently, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You are safe. You collapsed outside my gate during the storm. I brought you inside." Alina's eyes widened as recognition dawned, and she stared at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You are the Duke," she said, her voice hoarse and weak. "Nathaniel Ashford." "I am," he confirmed, "and you are Alina Whitmore, I believe. My steward mentioned your name, though I confess I did not understand its significance until I saw this." He held up the locket, watching carefully as her expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, cautious hope. "That was my husband's," she said quietly. "Julian kept it hidden away for years. He never told me exactly where it came from, only that it had belonged to his mother, and that it was the only thing he had left of her." "His mother," Nathaniel repeated softly, his voice thick with emotion he had not expected to feel so strongly. "Her name was Isabel, was it not?" Alina nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes as she watched the Duke's composure begin to crack, his carefully maintained control slipping away to reveal the raw grief beneath it. "Then it is true," Nathaniel whispered, more to himself than to her. "Julian was my son." Alina watched him carefully, uncertain how to respond to the mixture of grief and wonder playing across his features. She had come to this house hoping only for shelter, for some small mercy that might allow her and her unborn child to survive the winter. She had not expected to witness a man's entire understanding of his life crumble and reshape itself before her eyes. "He never knew for certain," she said gently, wanting to offer him whatever comfort she could. "Julian suspected, from things his mother had told him before she passed, but he was never able to confirm it. He was afraid, I think, of what it might mean if he tried to find you and was turned away." Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, a wave of sorrow washing over his face. "I never knew he existed," he said. "Isabel never told me she was carrying a child when we were separated. If I had known, I would have fought for both of you, regardless of the consequences. I would have never allowed my family to keep me from my own son." "She may not have known herself at first," Alina offered. "Or perhaps she believed it was safer for everyone if you never found out. I cannot say for certain. Julian rarely spoke of it, and when he did, it was always with a great deal of pain." "Where is he now?" Nathaniel asked, though something in his tone suggested he already feared the answer. "I would like very much to meet my son, if such a thing is still possible." Alina's throat tightened, and she found it difficult to meet his gaze. "Julian passed away 8 days ago," she said softly. "His heart simply stopped in his sleep. There was no warning, no illness we knew of beforehand. He was gone before I even woke that morning." The color drained further from Nathaniel's already pale face, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring at the locket in his hand as though it might somehow reveal a different answer than the one he had just received. "I am so sorry," Alina continued, her own grief resurfacing alongside his. "I know this must be a terrible shock, learning of a son you never knew, only to discover in the same moment that he has already been taken from this world." "And you," Nathaniel said after a long silence, his voice rough with emotion, "you are carrying his child." "I am," Alina confirmed, her hand instinctively returning to her belly. 7 months now. After Julian passed, his family made it clear that neither the child nor I were welcome to remain under their roof. They said cruel things, things I do not wish to repeat, and gave me little choice but to leave. I did not know where else to turn. Julian had mentioned you once in confidence, and I had nowhere else left to try. Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair, moving to stand near the fire, his back to her as he composed himself. When he finally turned around, his expression had hardened into something resolute, though his eyes remained glassy with unshed tears. "You will not leave this house," he said firmly. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not for as long as you wish to remain. You are carrying my grandchild, Alina. Whatever mistakes were made in the past, whatever pain my family's rigid expectations caused, I will not allow history to repeat itself. You and your child will want for nothing under my protection." Alina stared at him, overwhelmed by the sudden and unexpected shift in her circumstances. Only hours earlier, she had believed she might die alone in the snow, forgotten and unclaimed. Now she was being offered a home, a family, a future she had not dared to hope for. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "There is no need for thanks," Nathaniel replied gently. "If anything, I owe you and my son a debt I can never fully repay. I failed him before he was ever born, through no fault of my own perhaps, but the failure remains mine to carry. Let me at least ensure that his child never suffers the same fate." As the conversation settled into a quieter, more reflective tone, neither of them noticed the figure lingering just beyond the doorway, listening to every word with growing alarm. Edmund Colton, Nathaniel's nephew, and until this moment, the presumed heir to the entire Ashford estate, had arrived at the house only minutes earlier to discuss matters of business with his uncle. Instead, he found himself frozen in the hallway, absorbing a conversation that threatened to unravel every plan he had spent years quietly arranging. His expression, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, twisted into something cold and calculating as he processed what he had just heard. A grandchild, an unexpected heir. Everything he had believed about his own future, his own inheritance, was suddenly and violently thrown into question. He stepped back silently from the doorway, careful not to alert either occupant of the room to his presence, his mind already racing through the possibilities of how he might address this unwelcome development before it could take root any further within the household. Whatever kindness his uncle intended to extend toward this stranger and her unborn child, Edmund had no intention of allowing it to proceed without a fight. Edmund Colton did not sleep that night. He sat in his private study on the far side of the estate, a glass of untouched brandy sweating on the desk before him, his mind turning over the conversation he had overheard with an intensity that bordered on obsession. For years, he had positioned himself carefully as the natural successor to his uncle's title and fortune. He had attended every family gathering, offered his services on every business matter, and cultivated an image of loyalty and devotion that he believed had secured his place beyond question. Now, in the span of a single evening, all of that careful planning stood on the verge of collapse. He could not simply confront his uncle directly, not without revealing that he had been listening at doorways like a common servant. He needed to approach this problem with the same patience and precision he applied to every other obstacle in his life. If this woman, this Alina Whitmore, truly carried Nathaniel's grandchild, then Edmund's inheritance was no longer guaranteed. Worse, if the child turned out to be a boy, Edmund's claim to the title itself might be entirely erased. He rose from his desk and moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds glowing faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere in that house, a woman he had never met was sleeping soundly in a guest room, unaware that her arrival had transformed her into his greatest threat. He needed information. He needed to know everything about this Alina Whitmore, her history, her family, her relationship with the man she claimed was his uncle's son. If there was any inconsistency in her story, any thread he could pull to unravel the entire narrative, he intended to find it. By morning, Edmund had already sent quiet inquiries to a private investigator he had used on occasion for matters requiring discretion. He requested a full account of Alina's background, her marriage to Julian, and any details surrounding Julian's own birth and upbringing that might cast doubt on his claimed parentage. He instructed the investigator to work quickly and quietly, promising a substantial reward for results delivered before the week's end. Meanwhile, within the main house, Alina woke to a world entirely different from the one she had known only a day before. She had been given a spacious guest room, warm and beautifully furnished, with a fire already burning gently in the hearth when she opened her eyes. A young maid named Clara had been assigned to attend to her needs, and within minutes of waking, Alina found herself surrounded by a level of comfort and care she had not experienced since long before Julian's passing. "His Grace has requested that you join him for breakfast when you feel well enough," Clara said gently, helping Alina settle into a soft robe. "He said there is no rush, and that you should rest as long as you need." Alina nodded, still adjusting to the strange new reality of her circumstances. Only yesterday she had been convinced she would not survive the night. Now she was being treated with a gentleness and respect she had almost forgotten was possible. When she finally made her way downstairs, moving carefully given her condition, she found Nathaniel waiting for her in a bright, sunlit dining room, a modest breakfast already laid out on the table. He rose immediately when she entered, pulling out a chair for her with a courtesy that struck her as almost old-fashioned. "I trust you slept well," he said, settling back into his own seat once she was comfortable. "Better than I have in weeks," Alina admitted. "I still cannot quite believe any of this is real." "Nor can I if I am honest," Nathaniel replied with a faint, sad smile. "I have spent the entire night thinking of Julian, of Isabel, of all the years I lost without ever knowing my own son existed. It is a great deal to absorb." They ate in relatively comfortable silence for a while, the earlier tension of their first meeting giving way to something gentler, more tentative. Nathaniel asked careful questions about Julian, wanting to know everything Alina could tell him about the son he had never met. She spoke of his kindness, his quiet sense of humor, the way he used to hum old tunes while working in their small garden. Nathaniel listened to every word, with an intensity that revealed just how deeply he mourned the years he had missed. "He would have liked you, I think," Alina said softly. "He always spoke of wanting to know his father, even without knowing who that father truly was. He used to wonder aloud, late at night, what kind of man had given him his stubbornness, since his mother always insisted it did not come from her side of the family." Nathaniel laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to surprise even himself. Isabel always did have a talent for insisting she was right about everything, even when the evidence suggested otherwise, he said. "I suppose it is fitting that our son inherited a bit of both of us." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, weaving between grief and unexpected warmth, before a sharp knock interrupted them. Grayson entered the room, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his posture suggested discomfort. "Your Grace, Master Edmund has arrived and wishes to speak with you regarding a private matter." Nathaniel's expression shifted subtly, and Alina noticed a flicker of wariness cross his features before he composed himself. "Send him in," he said. "There is no need for privacy." Whatever he wishes to discuss can be said in front of Alina as well. Edmund entered moments later, his expression carefully arranged into one of polite concern, though Alina immediately sensed something calculated beneath the surface of his demeanor. He was a tall man, sharply dressed, with the kind of practiced charm that seemed designed to disarm rather than reassure. "Uncle," he said smoothly, offering a slight bow before turning his attention to Alina. "And this must be our unexpected guest. I heard word of your arrival, and I must say, the circumstances sound quite extraordinary." "Alina, this is my nephew, Edmund Colton," Nathaniel said, his tone carefully neutral. "Edmund, this is Alina Whitmore. She was married to my son, Julian, whom I never had the privilege of knowing." Edmund's eyebrows rose in a display of surprise that Alina suspected was entirely rehearsed. "Your son," he repeated slowly. "Forgive me, uncle, but this is quite a remarkable claim. I was not aware you had ever fathered a child." "Nor was I," Nathaniel admitted. "The circumstances were complicated, and I only learned of his existence yesterday, tragically after his passing. Alina is carrying his child, my grandchild, and she will be remaining here under my protection for as long as necessary." Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he quickly smoothed his expression back into one of polite interest. "How extraordinary," he said. "And how fortunate, I suppose, that this woman happened to arrive at your gate during a snowstorm, carrying a locket that conveniently confirms her story." "Edmund," Nathaniel said, a warning edge creeping into his voice. "I only mean to say," Edmund continued smoothly, "that such claims deserve careful verification, particularly given the significant implications for the family's future. Surely you would not wish to extend such generosity without first confirming the truth of her account." Alina felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, though she forced herself to remain calm. "I understand your caution," she said evenly, meeting Edmund's gaze directly. "I did not come here seeking anything beyond shelter and safety for myself and my child. I have nothing to gain by lying, and everything to lose if my story were somehow disproven. I would welcome any investigation you wish to conduct, if it would ease your concerns." Something flickered across Edmund's face, a brief flash of surprise at her composure, before he recovered his practiced smile. "How reasonable of you," he said. "I am sure such an investigation would only serve to confirm your account, in which case there would be no harm in conducting one." "There will be no investigation," Nathaniel said firmly, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Alina's word, combined with the evidence I have already seen, is sufficient for me. This locket," he continued, retrieving it from his pocket and holding it up for Edmund to see, "belonged to Isabel, a woman I loved many years ago. I would recognize it anywhere. There is no question in my mind regarding the truth of what Alina has told me." Edmund studied the locket for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding slowly. "Of course, uncle. I only wish to ensure the family's interests were properly protected. I trust your judgment, as always." The words were polite, even deferential, but Alina caught the subtle undertone of resentment lurking beneath them, and she suspected that this conversation was far from over. Edmund excused himself shortly after, offering a final, carefully polite farewell before departing the room, though the tension he left behind lingered long after he was gone. "I apologize for his behavior," Nathaniel said once Edmund had left. "He has always been ambitious, though I had not realized until this moment just how deeply that ambition ran. I fear this news has unsettled him more than he cares to admit." "He believed he would inherit everything, did he not?" Alina asked quietly. Nathaniel sighed heavily. "He did, and I confess until yesterday I had allowed him to believe it, given that I had no children of my own to consider. I never imagined circumstances would change so dramatically or so suddenly." "I do not wish to cause trouble within your family," Alina said, worry creeping into her voice. "Perhaps it would be better if I found somewhere else to stay, somewhere that would not create such conflict." "Absolutely not," Nathaniel said firmly, reaching across the table to gently take her hand in a gesture of reassurance. You and your child are my family now, every bit as much as Edmund is. I will not allow his ambitions to dictate how I treat my own grandchild. Whatever conflict arises from this, I will handle it myself. You need only focus on your health and the safe arrival of your baby." Alina nodded, though a quiet unease settled in her chest as she thought of the calculating look she had seen in Edmund's eyes before he left the room. She sensed, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that his acceptance of Nathaniel's decision had been nothing more than a temporary retreat, a strategic pause before whatever plan he intended to pursue next. Outside, the storm had finally begun to clear, the snow settling into a peaceful stillness across the grounds. But within the walls of the Ashford estate, a different kind of storm was only just beginning to gather, one that would test the loyalty, patience, and resolve of everyone involved before it finally ran its course. After breakfast, Nathaniel offered to show Alina around the estate, wanting her to feel more settled in her new surroundings. They walked slowly through long corridors lined with portraits of ancestors long since passed, Nathaniel pointing out various relatives with brief anecdotes that occasionally drew a small laugh from Alina, despite the heaviness of the previous conversation. Eventually, they arrived at a quiet room near the eastern wing of the house, one that Nathaniel opened with a hesitance that suggested he rarely visited it himself. Inside, dust sheets covered most of the furniture, though a single portrait remained uncovered above the fireplace, depicting a young woman with warm eyes and a gentle, knowing smile. "This was Isabel," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he studied the painting. "I commissioned this portrait shortly before our families separated us. I could never bring myself to remove it, nor could I bear to look at it often. I had it moved here to this unused room so that I might visit it only when I felt strong enough to face the memories it carried." Alina stepped closer, studying the portrait with a growing sense of wonder. The resemblance to Julian was unmistakable, particularly in the shape of the eyes and the soft curve of the smile. She felt tears gathering as she realized she was looking, in some sense, at her husband's mother, a woman she had never known but who had clearly shaped so much of who Julian had become. "He had her smile," Alina said softly. "I did not realize it until just now, but it is exactly the same." Nathaniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he absorbed the weight of that observation. "I wish I could have known him," he said finally. "I wish I could have watched him grow, could have taught him the things a father teaches his son. I wish more than anything that I could have protected him and Isabel from the cruelty of my own family's expectations." "You could not have known," Alina said gently. "You cannot blame yourself for a truth you were never given the chance to learn." "Perhaps not," Nathaniel replied, though his tone suggested he was far from convinced. "But I can ensure that his child never suffers from the same silence and secrecy. Whatever else happens, whatever difficulties Edmund's resentment may bring, I intend to raise this child knowing exactly who they are and where they come from. There will be no secrets in this family, not anymore." They remained in the quiet room for a while longer, Alina asking gentle questions about Isabel, and Nathaniel sharing what memories he still carried. Fragments of a love story cut short by circumstances neither of them had been able to control. It was, in its own way, a healing conversation for both of them, two people bound together by grief and by the unexpected gift of a child who represented both an ending and a new beginning. As the afternoon wore on, Alina found herself growing tired, the emotional weight of the past 2 days finally catching up with her. Nathaniel insisted she rest, escorting her back to her room personally, and promising that Clara would bring a light meal later in the evening. Alone in her room, Alina settled into a comfortable chair near the window, watching the last of the storm clouds clear from the sky outside. She thought of Julian, wishing desperately that he could have lived to see this moment, to meet the father he had always wondered about, to witness the acceptance and warmth that Nathaniel had shown her without hesitation. She also thought, with a growing sense of unease, of Edmund's cold, calculating expression as he had studied the locket in his uncle's hand. She did not know the man well, but something in his demeanor had left her deeply unsettled, a quiet certainty that he would not simply accept his uncle's decision without some form of resistance. She had no way of knowing, as she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, that across the estate, in his private study, Edmund had already received the first response from his investigator. A brief message indicating that preliminary findings on Alina Whitmore's background had turned up something unexpected, something that Edmund believed might prove very useful indeed in the days to come. Edmund read the brief note twice, a slow smile spreading across his face as he folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. It was not much, not yet, but it was enough of a thread to begin pulling. He poured himself another glass of brandy, this one meant for celebration rather than restless worry, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Whatever secrets Alina Whitmore carried alongside her grief, he intended to uncover every last one of them, regardless of the cost to her fragile new place within the family. His inheritance, his future, his entire sense of purpose depended on it, and he was not a man accustomed to losing what he believed rightfully belonged to him. The storm outside had passed, but within the walls of the Ashford estate, the true conflict was only just beginning to take shape. 3 days passed before Edmund made his next move, and in that time, Alina had begun to settle into a fragile but genuine sense of belonging within the Ashford household. Nathaniel had insisted she see the family physician regularly to monitor her health and the progress of her pregnancy, and he had personally overseen the preparation of a nursery in one of the estate's sunniest rooms, filling it with everything a newborn might need. Alina had protested gently at first, insisting she did not wish to impose further on his generosity, but Nathaniel had waved away her concerns with a firmness that left no room for argument. "This child is my grandchild," he had told her simply. "There is nothing excessive about ensuring they arrive into this world with every comfort I can provide. Please, allow me this small joy. It is the least I can do, after everything Julian and Isabel were denied." The staff, too, had grown warmer toward her over those few days, though Alina suspected some of that warmth stemmed from genuine curiosity about the dramatic circumstances of her arrival rather than pure kindness. Clara, in particular, had become something of a friend, chatting easily with Alina during quiet afternoons and sharing small bits of household gossip that helped Alina feel less like an outsider within the grand estate. It was during one such afternoon, as Alina rested in the estate's modest library, that Grayson appeared at the door with an expression that immediately set her on edge. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "His Grace has asked that you join him in his study. Master Edmund is also present." Alina's stomach tightened with unease as she rose to follow him. She had not spoken with Edmund since their initial confrontation over breakfast, though she had occasionally glimpsed him around the estate, always watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. When she entered the study, she found Nathaniel seated behind his desk, his expression tense and unreadable, while Edmund stood near the window, a folder clutched in his hands with an air of barely contained triumph. "Alina, please sit," Nathaniel said, gesturing to a chair. "Edmund has brought forward some information that he believes is relevant to your situation. I wanted you present to address it directly." Alina lowered herself carefully into the chair, her heart pounding as she glanced between the two men. "What kind of information?" she asked. Edmund stepped forward, opening the folder with a deliberate slowness that Alina recognized as a calculated attempt to unsettle her. "I took the liberty of conducting some inquiries into your background, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Purely for the family's protection, you understand. What I discovered raises some rather significant questions." "Edmund," Nathaniel warned, his tone sharp. "Please, uncle, allow me to finish," Edmund continued smoothly. "According to my investigator's findings, Julian's birth records list his mother as a woman named Isabel Renshaw, which aligns with your account. However, there is no official record indicating that Isabel ever named a father on Julian's birth certificate. The space is simply left blank." Alina felt a flicker of confusion rather than fear. "That does not surprise me," she said carefully. Julian told me himself that his mother never officially named his father, out of fear of what it might mean for both of them. That is precisely why he never had definitive proof of his parentage, only his mother's private confessions and the locket she left him. A convenient explanation, Edmund said, though his confidence seemed to waver slightly at her composed response. But there is more. My investigator also discovered that Isabel Renshaw married another man, a merchant named Thaddeus Renshaw, only 4 months after Julian's birth. This same man is listed on other family records as Julian's legal father, despite what you claim to be the truth. Alina's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering fragments of what Julian had once told her. Julian explained that as well, she said. Isabel married quickly after his birth in order to protect herself and her son from the scandal of raising a child alone, particularly one fathered by a man of such high standing whose family had already rejected them both. Thaddeus Renshaw agreed to raise Julian as his own in exchange for a private arrangement, though Julian always knew, from a young age, that Thaddeus was not his biological father. His mother told him the truth when he was old enough to understand, along with the locket as proof of who she had truly loved. Nathaniel's expression had grown increasingly pained throughout this exchange, the details confirming painful truths he had never known about the woman he had loved and the sacrifices she had been forced to make alone. "This aligns entirely with what I know of Isabel's character," he said quietly. "She was fiercely protective, and I have no doubt she would have done whatever necessary to shield our son from scandal, even if it meant a marriage of convenience to another man." Edmund's jaw tightened, clearly frustrated that his findings had not produced the doubt he had hoped for. "Perhaps," he said, "but this still leaves us with nothing beyond Mrs. Whitmore's word and a locket that could have been obtained through any number of means. I am not suggesting she is lying, uncle, only that we ought to seek more definitive proof before formally recognizing her child as your legitimate heir." "What kind of proof would satisfy you, Edmund?" Nathaniel asked, his patience visibly thinning. "There may be individuals still living who could confirm the relationship between you and Isabel, or who attended Julian's birth and could speak to the circumstances surrounding it," Edmund suggested. "A midwife, perhaps, or household staff who served your family during that time. Surely such testimony would remove all doubt, for everyone's benefit, including Mrs. Whitmore's own reputation." Alina studied Edmund carefully, sensing that his suggestion, while framed as reasonable, was likely intended to buy him more time to search for inconsistencies rather than genuinely seeking the truth. Still, she found herself unable to object to the logic of his proposal, particularly given how much was at stake for her unborn child's future standing within the family. "I have no objection to further verification," she said calmly. "I have nothing to hide, and if such testimony exists, I welcome its discovery. It would put all doubts to rest, for everyone's sake." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, clearly grateful for her composure in the face of Edmund's pointed skepticism. "Very well," he said finally. "Edmund, if you believe such witnesses can be located, you have my permission to pursue that inquiry, provided it is conducted with appropriate discretion and respect for Alina's dignity throughout the process." "Of course, uncle," Edmund said, though the slight curl of his lips suggested a satisfaction that had little to do with dignity or respect. "I will begin making inquiries immediately." He excused himself shortly after, leaving Nathaniel and Alina alone in the tense quiet that followed his departure. Nathaniel reached across the desk, gently taking Alina's hand in a gesture of reassurance. "I am sorry you were subjected to that," he said. "Edmund's methods are far from gentle, though I understand, to some degree, the fear driving his behavior. He has built his entire future around an inheritance he now fears may no longer be his." "I understand his fear," Alina said quietly, "but I worry that his desperation may lead him to actions that go beyond simple verification. I fear he may attempt to manufacture doubt where none rightfully exists." "I share that concern," Nathaniel admitted. "Which is precisely why I intend to conduct my own inquiries alongside his, quietly and independently, to ensure that whatever conclusions are reached reflect the truth, rather than Edmund's own ambitions. I will not allow him to manipulate this situation for his own benefit, regardless of how carefully he attempts to disguise his intentions. Alina nodded, grateful for his support, though a quiet unease continued to settle in her chest. She had come to this estate seeking only safety and shelter, yet she now found herself at the center of a conflict far larger and more complicated than she had ever anticipated, one that threatened not only her own place within the family, but the very legitimacy of her unborn child's future. That evening, as she lay in bed unable to sleep, she found herself thinking once again of Julian, wishing desperately that he could offer some guidance, some reassurance that everything would eventually resolve itself in their child's favor. She placed a gentle hand against her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath her palm, and made a silent vow to protect this child's rightful place within the family, regardless of whatever obstacles Edmund chose to place in their path. Outside her window, the estate grounds lay peaceful and quiet beneath a fresh layer of snow. But Alina understood now that the true storm she faced had little to do with weather, and everything to do with the quiet, calculated ambitions of a man determined not to lose what he believed was rightfully his. The following morning, Nathaniel called a quiet meeting with his personal solicitor, a longtime family associate named Frederick Lang, whom he trusted implicitly with matters of great sensitivity. He explained the full situation, from Alina's dramatic arrival to Edmund's pointed skepticism, and asked Frederick to begin his own discreet investigation into the matter, separate from whatever Edmund was arranging. "I want to know the truth, Frederick," Nathaniel said firmly. Not for the purpose of doubting Alina, but to ensure that when the truth is finally established beyond question, no one, including Edmund, can continue to cast doubt upon it. "I owe my son that much, even in his absence." Frederick nodded solemnly, promising to begin his inquiries immediately, starting with hospital and church records from the region where Isabel had lived following her separation from Nathaniel, as well as any surviving household staff who might have served the Renshaw family during that period. Meanwhile, across the estate, Edmund had already set his own plans into motion, though his methods differed considerably from his uncle's more measured approach. He met privately with his investigator that same afternoon in a quiet tavern several miles from the estate, well away from prying eyes and familiar faces. "I need more than birth records and marriage certificates," Edmund said, sliding a folded stack of currency across the table. "I need something concrete, something that will cast genuine doubt on her claims, or failing that, something that will simply take too long to disprove before the child is born and formally recognized." The investigator, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Silas, studied the money for a moment before pocketing it smoothly. "There are always ways to create confusion, Mr. Colton," he said quietly. "Documents can be misplaced. Witnesses can be persuaded to remember things differently than they originally did, particularly if properly compensated. It would take time and considerable expense, but it could certainly be arranged." Edmund considered this carefully, weighing the risks against the potential reward. He was not, by nature, a man inclined toward outright deception, but the prospect of losing everything he had spent years building toward pushed him toward considerations he might otherwise have dismissed entirely. "Do what is necessary," he said finally. "But be careful. My uncle is not a fool, and if any of this is traced back to me, the consequences would be far worse than simply losing an inheritance I never fully possessed to begin with." Silas nodded, understanding the unspoken warning clearly. "I will be discreet, Mr. Colton. You need not worry on that account." As Edmund made his way back toward the estate that evening, his conscience stirred uncomfortably beneath the surface of his determination. He told himself repeatedly that he was not acting out of pure greed, but out of a genuine concern for the family's legacy, a legacy he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit and protect. If Alina's claims were true, he reasoned, then a small delay in confirming them would cause no real harm. And if her claims were somehow false, even in part, then his actions would ultimately serve to protect the family from a costly and embarrassing mistake. It was a fragile justification, and some quiet part of him recognized it as such. But ambition has a way of silencing doubt when the stakes feel high enough, and Edmund had convinced himself, at least for the moment, that the ends would ultimately justify whatever means proved necessary along the way. Back at the estate, unaware of the quiet machinations unfolding against her, Alina spent the evening writing a letter to Margaret Hale, an elderly woman who had once served as a nurse in the small town where Julian had grown up. Julian had mentioned her name occasionally over the years, recalling how she had cared for his mother during his birth and had remained a trusted family friend for many years afterward. Alina hoped, if she could locate the woman, that Margaret might be able to provide additional confirmation of the circumstances surrounding Julian's birth, offering yet another thread of truth that Edmund would find difficult to dispute. She sealed the letter carefully, intending to send it the following morning, unaware that the very woman she sought to contact would soon become a crucial figure in the unfolding conflict, one whose testimony would ultimately determine the fate of everyone involved. For now, though, Alina simply hoped for a peaceful night's rest, uncertain of what new challenges the coming days might bring, but determined, more than ever, to protect the truth of her husband's legacy and the future of the child growing steadily within her. The letter Alina sent to Margaret Hale traveled slowly through the winter roads, delayed further by lingering patches of snow that made travel treacherous across the countryside. While she waited for a response, Alina's days settled into a fragile rhythm of medical checkups, quiet walks through the estate's covered gardens, and increasingly warm conversations with Nathaniel, who seemed determined to learn everything he could about the son he had never known. Despite the underlying tension surrounding Edmund's ongoing investigation, Alina found herself growing genuinely fond of Nathaniel, appreciating the gentle patience with which he treated her, and the obvious depth of grief and love he carried for both Isabel and Julian, even in their absence. He often asked her small, specific questions, wanting to know Julian's favorite foods, the sound of his laughter, the way he had proposed to Alina years earlier. Each answer seemed to fill in another small piece of the son Nathaniel had lost before ever having the chance to know him. "He proposed to me in the rain," Alina told him one afternoon, as they sat together in the estate's modest conservatory, surrounded by winter-blooming flowers that Nathaniel had specifically requested be cultivated for her comfort. "We had been caught outside during a sudden storm, and rather than seeking shelter immediately, he simply dropped to one knee right there in the mud, completely soaked, and asked me to marry him. I laughed so hard I nearly said, no, simply out of disbelief." Nathaniel chuckled warmly at the image, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That does sound like something Isabel would have found endlessly amusing," he said. "She always did appreciate a bit of foolish romance over practical sensibility." These small, shared memories became a source of comfort for both of them, weaving together the fragmented pieces of a family history that had been kept apart for far too long. Alina began to feel, for the first time since Julian's passing, that she was not entirely alone in her grief, that someone else in the world carried the same profound sense of loss regarding the man she had loved. However, this fragile peace was disrupted one afternoon when Grayson arrived at the conservatory with an unusually urgent expression, informing Nathaniel that a visitor had arrived requesting an audience regarding a matter of significant importance. "Who is it, Grayson?" Nathaniel asked, setting aside his tea with a puzzled frown. "A solicitor, Your Grace, representing the Thornwood family. He claims to have information regarding Mrs. Whitmore's late husband that he believes you would want to hear immediately." Alina felt a cold knot form in her stomach at the mention of an unfamiliar name, and she exchanged a worried glance with Nathaniel before he instructed Grayson to bring the visitor to his study. The solicitor, a thin, nervous man named Percival Doyle, seemed uncomfortable from the moment he entered the room, glancing repeatedly between Nathaniel and Alina as though uncertain how his news would be received. "Your Grace," he began carefully, "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I felt it necessary given the sensitivity of the matter. I represent the interests of a client who wishes to remain anonymous for the time being, though I can assure you the information I bring is entirely credible and verifiable." "Go on," Nathaniel said, his patience already thinning at the man's cautious approach. "My client has come into possession of documents suggesting that Julian Ashford, formerly known as Julian Renshaw, may have entered into a private financial arrangement several years ago that could complicate matters of inheritance currently under consideration," Percival explained, his voice growing steadier as he continued. "Specifically, documents suggesting that Julian accepted a substantial sum of money in exchange for formally renouncing any future claim to the Ashford title or estate, on behalf of himself and any future descendants." The room fell into a stunned silence. Alina's heart pounded painfully in her chest, disbelief and confusion warring within her as she tried to process what she was hearing. "That is impossible," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Julian never mentioned any such arrangement. He did not even know for certain that Nathaniel was his father until shortly before his death, and even then, he never pursued any formal claim or financial arrangement regarding it." "I understand your skepticism, Mrs. Whitmore," Percival said carefully, "but my client possesses a signed document, dated approximately 2 years ago, bearing what appears to be Julian's signature, along with a corresponding record of a significant financial transfer made around the same time." Nathaniel's expression had grown increasingly stony throughout this exchange, his earlier warmth replaced by a hardened, calculating focus. "May I see this document?" he asked. Percival hesitated. "My client has requested that the original remain in their possession for the time being, though I have brought a copy for your review." He produced a folded paper from his coat and handed it across the desk to Nathaniel, who studied it carefully, his frown deepening with each passing moment. Alina watched anxiously, unable to see the document clearly from her seat but desperate to understand what it contained. "This signature does not match what little correspondence I have seen of Julian's handwriting," Nathaniel said slowly, though his tone carried more caution than certainty. "But I confess, I have very limited experience with my son's handwriting to make such a judgment with complete confidence." "I have samples of Julian's handwriting at home," Alina said quickly. "Letters he wrote me, personal notes, his signature on our marriage documents. If you would allow me to retrieve them, I could compare them directly against whatever forgery has been presented here." "This is no forgery, Mrs. Whitmore," Percival said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "My client is entirely confident in the document's authenticity." "Your client who remains conveniently anonymous," Nathaniel said sharply, his patience finally breaking. "Mr. Doyle, I find this entire situation highly suspicious. You arrive unannounced, presenting a document from an unnamed source, immediately following my acknowledgement of Alina and her child as my rightful family. Forgive me if I struggle to view this as mere coincidence." Percival shifted uncomfortably under Nathaniel's pointed gaze. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am merely acting on behalf of my client's instructions. I have no personal stake in the outcome of this matter." "Then perhaps it is time your client stepped forward personally, rather than hiding behind anonymity while attempting to disrupt my family's affairs," Nathaniel said firmly. "Until such time as that occurs, I have no intention of accepting this document as genuine, particularly given the timing of its sudden appearance." Percival gathered his belongings quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontational turn the conversation had taken. "I will relay your concerns to my client, Your Grace. I apologize for any distress this visit may have caused." He departed hastily, leaving Nathaniel and Alina alone once again in the tense aftermath of the unexpected confrontation. Alina's hands trembled slightly as she processed everything she had just heard, a sick feeling settling in her stomach as she began to suspect the true source of this sudden, damaging accusation. "Edmund," she said quietly, "this has to be his doing, there is no other explanation." Nathaniel's expression darkened with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "I fear you may be right," he said. "Though I have no direct proof of his involvement, the timing is far too convenient to be coincidental. I will speak with Frederick immediately and ask him to investigate this document's origins alongside his other inquiries." "What if he succeeds in convincing others it is genuine?" Alina asked, fear creeping into her voice. "What if this becomes a public scandal that damages Julian's memory, or worse, prevents our child from ever being recognized as your rightful heir?" "I will not allow that to happen," Nathaniel said firmly, though Alina could see genuine concern beneath his resolute tone. "I promise you, Alina, I will fight this with everything I have. Julian's memory and his child's future deserve nothing less." Despite his reassurances, a heavy unease settled over the household in the days that followed. Nathaniel immersed himself in correspondence with Frederick, coordinating efforts to trace the origins of the mysterious document, while simultaneously continuing his own quiet investigation into confirming Alina's account beyond any reasonable doubt. Alina, meanwhile, retrieved every letter and document Julian had ever written her, carefully organizing them in preparation for whatever comparison or verification process might become necessary. She spent long hours reading through his old letters, tears occasionally slipping down her cheeks as she encountered small, private memories that reminded her painfully of everything she had lost. It was during one such evening, as she sat alone in her room surrounded by scattered papers, that Clara arrived with unexpected news that offered a small, desperately needed ray of hope amid the mounting tension. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara said, slightly breathless from hurrying up the stairs, "a letter has arrived for you from a woman named Margaret Hale. She says she received your correspondence and wishes to speak with you as soon as possible regarding matters concerning Julian's birth." Alina's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation as she took the letter from Clara's hands, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. As she read through Margaret's careful, elegant handwriting, a slow, cautious relief began to spread through her chest. Margaret confirmed that she had indeed served as the midwife present during Julian's birth, and that she remembered clearly the circumstances surrounding Isabel's pregnancy and subsequent marriage to Thaddeus Renshaw. More importantly, she indicated that she still possessed certain personal letters Isabel had written to her over the years, letters that spoke openly and repeatedly of her enduring love for Nathaniel and her grief over their forced separation. Margaret expressed her willingness to travel to the estate personally, offering her direct testimony to help settle the matter beyond any further doubt. Alina rushed downstairs immediately, finding Nathaniel still working alongside Frederick in his study, and shared the contents of the letter with barely contained excitement. "This could be exactly what we need," Nathaniel said, his expression brightening with renewed hope. "If Margaret is willing to testify, and if she truly possesses letters from Isabel confirming our relationship, it would provide undeniable proof that would silence Edmund's doubts once and for all." "I will write to her immediately," Frederick said, already reaching for paper and ink, arranging for her safe and comfortable travel to the estate as soon as possible. For the first time in days, a genuine sense of hope settled over the household, though Alina could not entirely shake the lingering unease she felt regarding Edmund's continued determination to protect his own interests. She sensed with a growing certainty that whatever plans he had already set into motion were far from finished, and that the coming days would likely bring further challenges before the truth could finally be fully and permanently established. Still, as she returned to her room that evening, cradling Margaret's letter carefully against her chest, Alina allowed herself a small, fragile moment of genuine optimism, the first she had truly felt since arriving at the estate. Perhaps, she thought, the truth would prevail after all, and perhaps her child would finally be granted the rightful place within the family that Julian himself had never been given the chance to claim. News of Margaret Hale's impending arrival did not remain confined within the walls of Nathaniel's study for long. Household staff, despite their best intentions, occasionally spoke among themselves of matters they overheard, and within 2 days, Word of the elderly midwife's letters had reached Edmund through a chain of careless conversations he had been quietly monitoring since Alina's arrival. He received the news while reviewing correspondence in his own modest townhouse several miles from the main estate, and the moment he understood its implications, a familiar tightness gripped his chest. If this woman truly possessed personal letters from Isabel confirming her relationship with Nathaniel, and if she was prepared to testify openly regarding the circumstances of Julian's birth, then his carefully constructed doubts would collapse entirely, leaving him with nothing to show for his efforts beyond a damaged reputation within the family. He summoned Silas once again, this time with considerably more urgency in his instructions. "A woman named Margaret Hale is traveling to my uncle's estate within the coming days," Edmund explained, pacing restlessly across his study as he spoke. "She claims to possess letters that could confirm Alina's entire account beyond dispute. I need to know everything about this woman, her current circumstances, her financial situation, anything that might be used to persuade her against testifying, or at the very least, to delay her arrival long enough for me to consider alternative approaches." Silas listened carefully, his expression betraying none of the discomfort he privately felt at the increasingly desperate nature of Edmund's requests. "I can make inquiries," he said cautiously, "though I must remind you, Mr. Colton, that interfering directly with a witness carries considerable risk, particularly if her testimony is already anticipated by your uncle's household. Any sudden misfortune befalling her journey would likely draw immediate suspicion in your direction." Edmund's jaw clenched at the implied warning, though he recognized the wisdom in Silas's caution. "I am not suggesting anything reckless," he said, though his tone lacked full conviction even to his own ears. "I simply wish to understand her circumstances fully before deciding how best to proceed. Perhaps she can be persuaded that her testimony is unnecessary, or convinced that her memories of events so long ago may not be as reliable as she believes." "I will see what can be arranged," Silas said carefully, though privately he harbored growing doubts about how far Edmund intended to take this pursuit, and whether he himself wished to remain associated with methods that seemed to grow more ethically questionable with each passing day. As Edmund's plans grew increasingly desperate, back at the estate, preparations continued for Margaret's arrival. Nathaniel arranged comfortable travel accommodations for the elderly woman, sending a private carriage to collect her, and ensuring that every possible comfort was provided for her journey, given her advanced age and the lingering winter conditions. Alina, meanwhile, found herself growing increasingly anxious as the days passed, torn between hope for Margaret's testimony and fear of what further obstacles Edmund might attempt to place in their path. She confided some of these fears to Nathaniel one evening as they sat together near the fire, the estate quiet around them. "I keep thinking of everything that could go wrong," she admitted. "What if something happens to delay her journey? What if Edmund finds some way to discredit her before she even arrives?" Nathaniel reached over, gently taking her hand in a gesture that had become increasingly familiar and comforting between them. "I understand your fears," he said quietly, "but I have taken precautions. Frederick has arranged for additional escorts to accompany Margaret's carriage, and I have instructed them to remain vigilant throughout the journey. Whatever Edmund may attempt, I do not believe he will act rashly enough to risk exposing himself so directly." "I hope you are right," Alina said softly, though the uncertainty in her voice remained evident. "There is something else I wish to discuss with you," Nathaniel continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Regardless of how Margaret's testimony unfolds, I have decided to move forward with formally acknowledging you and your child as members of this family. I have already begun drafting the necessary legal documents with Frederick's assistance, documents that will secure your child's position as my rightful heir, regardless of whatever challenges Edmund continues to raise." Alina stared at him, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Even without Margaret's testimony, even with the uncertainty surrounding Edmund's accusations?" "I am certain of who you are and who my son was," Nathaniel said firmly. The document Edmund's mysterious client presented was clearly fraudulent, constructed hastily and without proper attention to detail. I do not need further proof to know where my loyalty and family belong. Margaret's testimony, should it arrive, will simply serve as additional confirmation for anyone still harboring doubts, Edmund included. Tears welled in Alina's eyes as she absorbed the full weight of his commitment, a commitment that offered her and her unborn child a security she had scarcely dared to hope for only days earlier. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for believing me, for protecting us, for giving Julian's memory the dignity it deserves." "There is no need for thanks," Nathaniel replied gently. "You are my family now, Alina, as surely as if you had been born into it. I only regret that it took a snowstorm and near tragedy to bring us together." As their conversation continued late into the evening, neither of them could have anticipated just how close Margaret Hale's journey would come to disaster in the days ahead, nor how desperately Edmund's growing anxiety would push him toward decisions that threatened to expose the full extent of his scheming before the truth could ever be fully and properly established. The morning Margaret Hale was scheduled to depart for the Ashford estate, a thick fog rolled across the countryside, slowing travel and creating exactly the kind of conditions that made unexpected delays feel almost inevitable. Alina paced anxiously near the front windows of the estate for much of the day, watching the long drive for any sign of the approaching carriage, while Nathaniel attempted, with limited success, to distract her with quiet conversation and reassurances that all would be well. What neither of them knew was that Edmund, growing increasingly desperate as the hours ticked closer to Margaret's arrival, had made a decision that would test the very limits of his conscience. He had instructed Silas to intercept Margaret's carriage along its route, not with any intention of causing her physical harm, a line he told himself repeatedly he would never cross, but with the goal of delaying her arrival long enough to buy himself additional time to prepare a stronger defense against her testimony. Silas had arranged for a minor obstruction along a narrow section of the road, a fallen tree branch that would appear to be a natural consequence of the winter storms, forcing the carriage to take a longer, alternate route that would delay their arrival by several hours. It was a small, seemingly harmless deception, one that Edmund had convinced himself carried no real risk or consequence. He had not anticipated, however, that the alternate route would take Margaret's carriage past a small village in where Silas himself had arranged to be waiting, hoping for one final opportunity to speak with the elderly woman directly and perhaps persuade her, through carefully chosen words and a generous financial offer, to reconsider the necessity of her testimony altogether. When Margaret's carriage was forced to stop at the inn to allow the horses a brief rest before continuing their delayed journey, Silas approached her carefully, introducing himself as a concerned family friend eager to ensure her comfort during such an important journey. Margaret, despite her advanced age, possessed a sharp and perceptive mind, and she quickly grew suspicious of Silas's overly attentive manner and the pointed questions he asked regarding the nature of her testimony and its potential implications for the Ashford family's inheritance. "You are not simply a concerned friend, are you?" she said bluntly, studying him with narrowed eyes over her cup of tea. "I have lived long enough to recognize when someone is attempting to manipulate a situation for their own benefit." Silas, caught off guard by her directness, attempted to maintain his composed facade. "I assure you, madam, I only wish to ensure that whatever testimony you provide is given with a full and clear understanding of its consequences for everyone involved." "I understand the consequences perfectly well," Margaret replied firmly. "I have carried the truth of Isabel Renshaw's heartbreak for over 30 years, truth I promised her I would protect and share should the right circumstances ever arise. I do not intend to abandon that promise now, regardless of whatever concerns you or your employer may have regarding inheritance and family fortune." Her words struck Silas with unexpected force, and for the first time since beginning this entire endeavor, he felt a genuine pang of guilt regarding his role in Edmund's schemes. He excused himself shortly after, claiming a prior engagement, and made his way back toward his own lodgings, uncertain now of how to proceed with the increasingly troubling nature of his assignment. Margaret's carriage eventually resumed its journey, arriving at the Ashford estate several hours later than originally planned, though Alina's relief upon finally seeing the carriage approach the main drive was overwhelming, regardless of the delay. "You are here," Alina said, rushing forward to help Margaret from the carriage despite the elderly woman's gentle protests that she required no assistance. "I was so worried something had happened." "Merely a delayed road, my dear," Margaret said, though something in her expression suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Nothing to concern yourself over. I am here now, and that is what matters most." Nathaniel greeted Margaret warmly, escorting her personally into the main sitting room where a warm fire and refreshments had been prepared in anticipation of her arrival. Once she had settled comfortably and regained her strength from the journey, the conversation quickly turned to the matter that had brought her to the estate. "I understand you knew Isabel well," Nathaniel said gently, his voice carrying a mixture of anticipation and lingering grief. "I did," Margaret confirmed, her expression softening with fond remembrance. "I served as her personal midwife during Julian's birth and remained close with her for many years afterward, even after her marriage to Thaddeus Renshaw. She confided in me often, particularly in the early years, when her grief over losing you remained fresh and difficult to bear." She reached into a small bag she had carried with her throughout the journey, producing a bundle of aged letters tied carefully with a faded ribbon. "These are letters Isabel wrote to me over the years," she explained, handing them carefully to Nathaniel. "I believe they will answer many of the questions currently troubling your family." Nathaniel accepted the letters with trembling hands, his eyes glistening as he began reading through Isabel's familiar, elegant handwriting. Alina watched quietly, her own eyes filling with tears as she observed the profound impact these words were having on him, decades of buried grief and longing finally finding some measure of closure. The letters spoke openly of Isabel's enduring love for Nathaniel, her heartbreak over their forced separation, and her fierce determination to protect their son from the scandal and rejection that would have followed had the truth of his parentage ever become publicly known. She wrote candidly of her decision to marry Thaddeus, describing it not as a betrayal of her feelings for Nathaniel, but as a necessary sacrifice made purely for Julian's protection and future security. "She never stopped loving you," Margaret said softly, watching Nathaniel's reaction carefully. "Even in her final years before she passed, she spoke of you often, wondering what might have been had circumstances allowed you both the freedom to choose your own path." "When did she pass?" Nathaniel asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Nearly 10 years ago now," Margaret replied gently. "A gentle passing, surrounded by those who loved her. Julian was at her bedside until the very end. I believe that is when she finally told him the full truth of his parentage, along with the locket she had kept hidden away for so many years." Nathaniel nodded slowly, absorbing this final piece of the puzzle that had eluded him for so long. He looked toward Alina, his expression a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for bringing me this truth even after so many years." "I only wish I could have brought it to you sooner," Margaret replied gently. "Isabel always hoped in her heart that you might one day learn the truth and find some peace regarding the choices that were forced upon you both." The conversation continued for much of the afternoon, Margaret sharing additional memories and details that further solidified the undeniable truth of Alina's account. By evening, Nathaniel had gathered together the letters. Along with witness statements Frederick had already collected from other sources, into a comprehensive body of evidence that left no reasonable doubt regarding Julian's true parentage and Alina's rightful place within the family. When Edmund arrived at the estate the following morning, summoned by his uncle to review the newly compiled evidence, his expression remained carefully composed, though Alina noticed a subtle tension in his posture that suggested he already anticipated the outcome of this meeting. Nathaniel presented the evidence methodically, laying out Isabel's letters, Margaret's direct testimony, and Frederick's independent research confirming the timeline and circumstances surrounding Julian's birth. Edmund reviewed each document carefully, his expression growing increasingly strained as the weight of the evidence became undeniable. "This appears quite thorough," Edmund said finally, his voice carefully neutral despite the visible tension in his jaw. "I suppose there remains little room for further doubt." "None whatsoever," Nathaniel said firmly. "I have also asked Frederick to investigate the origins of the document your anonymous client presented last week, claiming Julian had renounced his inheritance rights. I trust you will not be surprised to learn that Frederick's inquiries have already traced the paper and ink used in that document to a supplier commonly used by a private investigator, operating out of the very town where your townhouse is located." The color drained slowly from Edmund's face as he realized the full extent of what his uncle had uncovered. "Uncle, I can explain." "There is no need," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice hard with barely controlled anger. "I understand your fear of losing an inheritance you believed was rightfully yours. I understand, to some degree, the desperation that drove your actions. But I will not tolerate deception within my own household, particularly deception aimed at denying my grandchild their rightful place within this family." Edmund's composure finally cracked entirely, years of carefully maintained charm giving way to raw, unfiltered panic. "Please, Uncle, I never intended any real harm. I only wished to protect what I believed." "You wish to protect your own interests," Nathaniel said sharply, "regardless of the cost to others. I will not pursue formal legal consequences against you, out of respect for the family name and the years of loyalty you have shown prior to this unfortunate episode. But you will apologize to Alina immediately, and you will cease all further interference in this matter, permanently." Edmund turned toward Alina, his expression a complicated mixture of shame and lingering resentment. "I apologize," he said stiffly, "for the distress my actions have caused you and your child. It was never my intention to cause genuine harm, only to protect the family's interests as I understood them." Alina studied him carefully, recognizing the incomplete sincerity in his words, but choosing, for the sake of peace within the family, to accept his apology graciously. "I understand your fears," she said quietly. "I hope, in time, we can move beyond this and build a relationship based on mutual respect, for the sake of the family we now share." Edmund nodded stiffly, though his expression remained guarded, and he excused himself from the room shortly after, leaving Nathaniel and Alina alone once again amid the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. "Do you believe he will truly cease his interference?" Alina asked once Edmund had departed. "I believe he understands now that further attempts would only damage his own standing beyond repair," Nathaniel replied thoughtfully. "Whether his resentment fades entirely remains to be seen, but I do not believe he will risk further direct confrontation, not after today." As the household settled into a quieter, more peaceful rhythm in the days that followed, Alina found herself finally able to exhale fully for the first time since her dramatic arrival weeks earlier. The truth had been established, undeniably and completely, and with it came a security she had scarcely dared to hope for during those desperate hours in the snow. Yet even as peace settled over the estate, a small, cautious part of her remained aware that Edmund's resentment, however carefully suppressed, had not entirely disappeared, and that the true test of the family's newfound unity still lay somewhere ahead, waiting patiently for the moment it might resurface once again. Margaret remained at the estate for several additional days, her presence a comfort to both Alina and Nathaniel, as they continued piecing together the fragments of Julian and Isabel's shared history. She shared stories of Julian's earliest years, describing him as a curious and gentle child who had always seemed slightly older than his age, carrying a quiet thoughtfulness that Margaret now recognized as inherited directly from Nathaniel. "He used to ask the most peculiar questions," Margaret recalled fondly one evening, as the three of them sat together near the fire. "Even as a small boy, he would ask why the stars appeared different depending on where you stood beneath them, or why some people were permitted to love freely while others were forced to hide their affections. I believe even then, some part of him sensed the truth of his own circumstances, long before Isabel ever spoke the words aloud. Nathaniel listened to every story with rapt attention, treasuring each new detail as though it were a precious gift recovered from a life he had never been permitted to fully experience. Alina, too, found comfort in these conversations, grateful to learn new dimensions of her husband's childhood that he himself had rarely spoken of during their marriage. He carried more sadness than he ever let show, Alina admitted quietly during one such conversation. I always sensed there was a part of him he kept hidden away, even from me. I understand now more fully where that sadness came from. He hid it well out of love for you, Margaret said gently. Isabel was the same in her own way. She carried her grief privately for most of her life, unwilling to burden those around her with the full weight of what she had lost. I believe Julian learned that same quiet strength from her example. As the days passed, Frederick finalized the legal documentation necessary to formally recognize Alina's child as Nathaniel's legitimate heir, pending only the child's birth to complete the formal registration. Nathaniel reviewed every document carefully, ensuring that Alina's future security, along with that of her child, remained fully protected regardless of any future circumstances that might arise. I want you to understand, he told her one evening as they reviewed the documents together, that regardless of whether your child is a son or a daughter, they will inherit my full title and estate, with you serving as their guardian and trustee until they reach an appropriate age to assume those responsibilities themselves. There will be no ambiguity, no room for future challenge from Edmund or anyone else who might seek to dispute their rightful place. Alina studied the documents carefully, overwhelmed once again by the depth of security and generosity Nathaniel continued to offer her. I do not know how Julian's child could ever repay such kindness, she said softly. There is nothing to repay, Nathaniel replied firmly. This is simply what family does for one another. I only regret that circumstances prevented me from offering this same protection to Julian himself, while he still lived. Despite the underlying grief that continued to color many of their conversations, a genuine warmth had settled over the household, a sense of healing that Alina had not believed possible only weeks earlier, when she had arrived at the estate's gate with nothing left but desperate hope and a fading heartbeat. Still, as the days grew shorter and the date of her expected delivery drew steadily closer, Alina found herself increasingly aware of a quiet tension lingering just beneath the surface of the household's newfound peace. A tension centered entirely on the continued, uncertain presence of Edmund Colton, whose careful apology had done little to fully erase the desperation and resentment that had driven his earlier actions. She could not yet know how significantly that lingering tension would resurface in the days ahead, nor how close her own life, and the life of her unborn child, would once again come to genuine and immediate danger before the family's story could finally reach its true resolution. Winter deepened over the following weeks, blanketing the estate grounds in layer after layer of fresh snow, though within the walls of the great house, the atmosphere remained considerably warmer than it had been during Alina's first arrival. Margaret had eventually returned to her own home, promising to visit again once the child arrived, and Frederick continued his careful work finalizing the legal protections that would secure Alina and her child's future within the family. Edmund, true to his word, had largely withdrawn from direct involvement in the household's affairs, though Alina occasionally glimpsed him during required family gatherings, his expression carefully neutral, his interactions with her polite but distant. She sensed that genuine reconciliation between them remained a distant prospect, though she took some comfort in the fact that his open hostility, at least, appeared to have subsided. It was during a particularly cold evening, only weeks before Alina's expected delivery date, that an unexpected crisis threatened to disrupt the fragile peace the household had worked so hard to establish. Alina had been resting in her room when a sudden, sharp pain gripped her abdomen, far more intense than the mild discomfort she had grown accustomed to during the final stretch of her pregnancy. She called out for Clara immediately, her voice tight with alarm, and within minutes, the entire household had been thrown into a state of urgent activity. The physician, summoned immediately from the nearby village, arrived within the hour, his expression grave as he examined Alina carefully. "The child is coming early," he announced, his tone carrying a seriousness that sent a fresh wave of fear through Nathaniel, who had remained close by Alina's side throughout the entire ordeal. "Several weeks early, in fact. This carries certain risks, both for the child and for Mrs. Whitmore herself." "What can be done?" Nathaniel asked urgently, his composure fraying visibly for the first time since Alina had arrived at the estate. "I will do everything within my power," the physician assured him. "But I must be honest, Your Grace, an early delivery of this nature carries genuine danger. I would recommend summoning additional medical assistance immediately, if such resources are available to you." Nathaniel wasted no time, dispatching riders immediately to the nearest town to summon a specialist known for handling difficult childbirths, while simultaneously ensuring that every possible comfort and resource within the estate was made available for Alina's care. As the night wore on, Alina's labor progressed with an intensity that left the entire household holding its collective breath. Clara remained constantly by her side, offering what comfort she could, while Nathaniel paced anxiously in the hallway outside, unable to fully process the possibility that he might lose both his newfound family in a single, cruel stroke of fate. It was during this tense waiting period that Edmund arrived at the estate, having heard word of the sudden crisis through hurried household gossip that had reached him despite his general distance from the family's daily affairs. He found Nathaniel pacing anxiously in the hallway, his usually composed uncle looking uncharacteristically fragile and afraid. "Uncle," Edmund said quietly, his own expression carrying a complicated mixture of concern and lingering guilt. "I came as soon as I heard. Is there anything I can do?" Nathaniel studied his nephew carefully, surprised by the apparent sincerity in his voice. "The physician has requested additional medical assistance from town," he said finally. "A specialist who may be better equipped to handle complications should they arise. I have already sent riders, but the roads remain difficult given the recent snow." "I know a faster route through the Eastern Pass," Edmund said immediately. "It is treacherous, but considerably quicker than the main road, particularly during winter conditions. I have traveled it many times myself and know it well. Allow me to fetch the specialist personally. I can move faster alone on horseback than any carriage could manage on the main road." Nathaniel hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Go quickly," he said. "And Edmund, thank you." Edmund nodded once, his expression resolute, before disappearing down the hallway and out into the freezing night, determined to prove, in whatever small way remained available to him, that his earlier actions did not define the entirety of his character. The journey through the Eastern Pass proved every bit as treacherous as Edmund had warned, the narrow path barely visible beneath the accumulated snow, the darkness pressing in around him with an oppressive weight that made every step forward feel like a genuine risk. Twice his horse nearly lost its footing on the icy terrain, and twice Edmund forced himself to remain calm, focused entirely on the urgent task before him. He reached the town considerably faster than the main road would have allowed, locating the specialist's residence with some difficulty given the late hour, and explaining the situation with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. The specialist, a capable and experienced woman named Dr. Wren, gathered her equipment immediately, and together they began the difficult return journey through the same treacherous pass, now made even more dangerous by the deepening darkness and worsening weather. Back at the estate, Alina's labor had grown increasingly difficult, the physician's expression growing more concerned with each passing hour. Nathaniel remained close by, holding Alina's hand tightly whenever he was permitted into the room, offering whatever quiet words of encouragement and comfort he could manage despite his own mounting fear. "You are stronger than you know," he told her during one such moment, his voice thick with emotion. "Julian would be so proud of the strength you have shown throughout all of this. I need you to hold on to that strength just a little longer." Alina, exhausted and in considerable pain, managed only a weak nod in response, her focus entirely consumed by the difficult labor she continued to endure. The physician worked steadily, his experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency, though the tension in his expression made clear that the situation remained precarious. It was nearly dawn when Edmund and Dr. Wren finally arrived back at the estate, both exhausted from their treacherous journey, but moving with urgent purpose the moment they entered the house. Dr. Wren immediately took charge of the situation, her calm, confident demeanor providing a reassuring presence that the exhausted household desperately needed. "The child is positioned awkwardly," she explained after a brief examination, "which has been complicating the delivery. I believe I can correct this, but I will need everyone's full cooperation and patience." What followed were the most agonizing hours of Alina's life, filled with pain and fear, and a desperate, unwavering determination to protect the child she had carried through so much hardship already. Nathaniel remained by her side throughout, his own fear evident but carefully controlled, offering steady reassurance even as his heart pounded with dread regarding the uncertain outcome. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the frost-covered windows, a thin, indignant cry pierced the tense silence of the room, and Dr. Wren's exhausted but relieved voice announced the safe arrival of a healthy baby boy. Nathaniel felt his knees nearly buckle with overwhelming relief as he watched the tiny, squirming infant being carefully placed into Alina's exhausted but joyful arms. Tears streamed freely down his face as he studied the small, perfect features of his grandson, the living continuation of Julian and Isabel's story, born into a family that would finally give him the recognition and love he deserved from the very moment of his birth. "He is beautiful," Nathaniel whispered, his voice breaking with emotion as he gently touched the infant's tiny hand. "Julian's son, my grandson." Alina, despite her exhaustion, smiled through her own tears, overwhelming gratitude and love washing over her as she held her child for the first time. "We should name him after his father," she said softly. "Julian would have wanted that, I think." "Julian Nathaniel Ashford," Nathaniel said quietly, testing the name aloud with obvious emotion. "A fitting tribute to both the son I lost and the grandson who now carries his legacy forward." Outside the room, having waited anxiously throughout the entire ordeal, Edmund finally allowed himself a genuine, unguarded smile of relief upon hearing news of the safe delivery. Whatever complicated feelings still lingered regarding his own diminished inheritance, he found himself surprised by the depth of genuine joy he felt at the safe arrival of his uncle's grandson, a joy that felt entirely separate from the ambitions and resentments that had driven his earlier actions. When Nathaniel emerged from the room sometime later, exhausted but radiant with happiness, he found Edmund waiting quietly in the hallway, uncertain of his welcome given the circumstances. "Thank you," Nathaniel said simply, embracing his nephew with a warmth that caught Edmund entirely off guard. "Your quick action tonight may well have saved both Alina and my grandson. I will not forget this, Edmund, nor the courage it took to face that treacherous pass in the dead of night." Edmund, overwhelmed by the unexpected gratitude, found himself unable to respond immediately, his own emotions finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for so long. "I am sorry, Uncle," he said finally, his voice thick with genuine remorse, "for everything I did before tonight. I let my fear and ambition cloud my judgment in ways I deeply regret. I hope, in time, I can earn back your trust, and perhaps even build a genuine relationship with Alina and her son." "Tonight is a good beginning," Nathaniel said gently. "Come, meet your new cousin. I believe introductions are long overdue." As dawn fully broke over the snow-covered estate, casting warm golden light across rooms that had witnessed both crisis and triumph within the span of a single, exhausting night, the Ashford family finally began to feel, for the first time since Alina's dramatic arrival weeks earlier, truly and completely whole. Word of the birth spread quickly throughout the estate, and by mid-morning, The household staff had gathered small gifts and well wishes for the newest member of the family, their genuine affection for Alina evident in the warmth of their celebration. Clara, who had grown particularly close to Alina over the preceding weeks, wept openly with joy as she held the infant briefly, marveling at how quickly circumstances had changed since that first desperate night when Alina had arrived nearly frozen at the estate's gate. Dr. Wren remained for several additional hours, ensuring that both mother and child continued to recover well from the difficult delivery, before finally accepting Nathaniel's grateful offer of rest and refreshment before her own journey home. "You have a remarkable family, Your Grace," she remarked before departing. "I have rarely witnessed such genuine devotion surrounding a birth, particularly one that began under such difficult and unusual circumstances." Nathaniel could only nod in agreement, still overwhelmed by the events of the previous night and the profound joy that had followed such genuine fear. He spent much of that first day simply sitting quietly beside Alina's bed, watching his grandson sleep peacefully, marveling at the small, delicate features that so clearly echoed both Julian and Isabel. Later that afternoon, once Alina had rested sufficiently, Nathaniel gently raised a request that had been weighing on his mind since the earliest hours of dawn. "I would like to visit Julian's resting place," he said quietly, "to tell him, in whatever way such things can be communicated, that his son has arrived safely, and that he will never lack for love or protection in this family." Alina, though still weak from the delivery, felt tears gather at his words. "I would like that very much," she said. "Perhaps once I have regained enough strength, we could visit together as a family." "I would like nothing more," Nathaniel replied, gently touching his grandson's tiny hand once again, marveling at how such a small life had managed to heal so many old wounds within a single winter. As the days following the birth settled into a peaceful, joyful rhythm, Edmund made a point of visiting regularly, his earlier resentment continuing to soften into something resembling genuine affection for his infant cousin. He brought small gifts on each visit, carved wooden toys and soft blankets, and though his relationship with Alina remained somewhat reserved, a quiet mutual respect had begun to develop between them, built upon the foundation of that desperate, snow-covered journey through the Eastern Pass. "I never imagined I would feel such relief at another child's safe arrival," Edmund admitted to Nathaniel one evening, watching quietly as the infant slept peacefully in his crib. "I spent so long fearing what his existence would mean for my own future, that I never considered what joy his presence might actually bring to this family." "Fear has a way of narrowing our vision," Nathaniel replied gently. "I am simply grateful you found your way back to clearer sight before any lasting damage was done." As winter began its slow transition toward the first hints of spring, the Ashford estate settled into a new and hopeful chapter, one built upon hard-won truth, unexpected reconciliation, and the profound, healing power of a family finally united after decades of painful separation. Alina, watching her son grow stronger with each passing day, found herself filled with a quiet, steady gratitude for the storm that had once nearly taken everything from her, yet had ultimately delivered her and her child into a life far richer and more secure than she had ever dared to imagine during those darkest, coldest hours at the estate's iron gate. Yet even amid this hopeful new beginning, Nathaniel understood that certain formal matters still required careful attention, legal proceedings that would need to be finalized publicly, in order to fully secure young Julian's future standing within both the family and society at large. It was a process that would require patience, careful diplomacy, and one final, decisive confrontation with the broader Ashford relatives, who had yet to learn of the dramatic changes unfolding within their family's most prominent branch. Spring arrived gently over the following weeks, melting away the last remnants of the harsh winter that had brought Alina to the Ashford estate under such desperate circumstances. With the change of season came renewed energy within the household, as Nathaniel began preparations for a formal gathering, intended to introduce Alina and young Julian to the wider Ashford family, and the broader social circles that would inevitably take great interest in such a significant development. There will be those who question the circumstances, Frederick warned during one of their planning sessions, particularly given how quickly everything has unfolded. It would be wise to present our case with complete confidence and thorough documentation, leaving no room for doubt or scandal to take root. Nathaniel nodded in agreement, though his confidence in the truth of Alina's account had never wavered since Margaret's testimony had confirmed every detail beyond reasonable dispute. "We will present the truth plainly," he said. "Isabel's letters, Margaret's testimony, and my own recognition of Julian as my son. Anyone who wishes to challenge this evidence is welcome to do so, though I doubt they will find any success in that endeavor." The gathering was arranged for a modest but elegant afternoon reception, held within the estate's grand hall, with extended family members and select acquaintances invited to witness the formal announcement. Alina, though nervous about facing such scrutiny, found herself steadied by Nathaniel's calm confidence and Edmund's genuine, if still somewhat reserved, support. "You need not worry about their opinions," Edmund told her privately before the gathering began. "I know from personal experience how quickly doubt can be manufactured, but I also know how completely it collapses when faced with genuine, undeniable truth. You have nothing to fear here, Alina. The truth stands entirely on your side." His words offered genuine comfort, and Alina found herself grateful for how far their relationship had evolved since those tense early days of suspicion and hostility. She had never imagined that the man who once sought to discredit her would become one of her most steadfast supporters. Yet the events of that desperate winter night had forged a bond between them that neither had anticipated. The reception itself proceeded with far less drama than anyone had feared. Nathaniel spoke with quiet dignity about Isabel, about the love they had shared decades earlier, and the painful separation that had been forced upon them by rigid family expectations he now deeply regretted having accepted. He spoke of Julian with evident pride and sorrow, mourning the years he had lost with a son he never had the chance to know, while celebrating the grandson who now carried that legacy forward. Several relatives asked pointed questions, understandably curious about the sudden and dramatic nature of these revelations, but Frederick's thorough documentation, combined with Margaret's written testimony and Isabel's own letters, left little room for genuine doubt. By the reception's conclusion, Alina found herself formally welcomed into the extended family, her son's position as Nathaniel's rightful heir fully and publicly acknowledged. "That went considerably better than I feared," Alina admitted to Nathaniel later that evening, once the last guests had finally departed and the estate had settled back into peaceful quiet. "Truth has a way of prevailing when presented with patience and confidence," Nathaniel replied, cradling his sleeping grandson gently in his arms. "I only wish Julian and Isabel could have witnessed this day themselves, to see how completely their story has finally found its rightful resolution." "Perhaps in some way they did," Alina said softly, watching the peaceful expression on her son's tiny face as he slept soundly in his grandfather's arms. "I like to believe that love finds a way to witness such moments, even from beyond what we can see or understand." As young Julian grew steadily over the following months, the estate transformed into a warmer, livelier place than it had been in decades. Nathaniel doted on his grandson with an enthusiasm that surprised even the household staff, who had grown accustomed to his previously reserved and solitary demeanor. He spent hours simply watching the infant sleep, marveling at each small milestone, determined to be present for every moment he had been denied with Julian himself. Alina, too, found herself flourishing within her new circumstances, gradually shedding the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of her life since Julian's sudden passing. She formed genuine friendships among the household staff, particularly with Clara, and slowly began to reclaim a sense of purpose and identity beyond simply surviving each difficult day. Edmund's visits became increasingly frequent as the months progressed, his relationship with both Alina and young Julian deepening into something that closely resembled genuine familial affection. He often brought small gifts during his visits, and took particular delight in the infant's growing recognition of his voice. A small joy that seemed to heal something within him that had remained wounded since his own difficult childhood, having lost his parents at a young age and grown up largely under Nathaniel's more distant guardianship. "I never had this kind of warmth growing up," he admitted to Alina one afternoon, watching young Julian reach curiously for his outstretched finger. "I suppose that is partly why I fought so hard to protect what I believed was my inheritance. I mistook material security for the kind of genuine belonging I actually craved." "You have that belonging now, if you wish to embrace it," Alina replied gently. "This family is large enough for all of us to find our place within it, without anyone needing to lose anything in the process." Edmund nodded slowly, genuine gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you, Alina, for your forgiveness, and for allowing me the chance to become part of this family in a way that feels far more meaningful than any inheritance ever could." As summer approached, Nathaniel arranged the visit to Julian's resting place that he had promised Alina months earlier, during those exhausted, joyful hours following young Julian's difficult birth. They traveled together, Alina, Nathaniel, and young Julian, to the quiet cemetery where Julian had been laid to rest, carrying flowers and a small portrait of the infant who now carried his name and legacy forward. Standing before the simple headstone, Nathaniel found himself overwhelmed with emotion, decades of grief and longing finally finding some measure of peaceful resolution. "I am sorry I never knew you," he said quietly, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I am sorry for every year we lost, every moment I was denied the chance to be your father. But I promise you, your son will never know that same absence. He will grow up knowing exactly who he is and how deeply he is loved." Alina stood quietly beside him, holding young Julian gently as tears streamed down her own face, grief and gratitude intertwining in a way that felt, finally, more healing than painful. "He has your smile," she said softly, looking down at her son. "Isabel's smile too, I think. He carries both of you within him, every single day." They remained at the gravesite for a while longer, sharing quiet memories and gentle words, before finally beginning their journey back toward the estate, toward the warm, secure future that had once seemed entirely impossible during those desperate, freezing hours at the estate's iron gate. That evening, as Alina settled young Julian into his crib within the nursery Nathaniel had so lovingly prepared for him, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the desperate widow who had once stumbled through a blinding snowstorm, clutching nothing but a fading hope and an old, tarnished locket. She thought of the frightened woman who had collapsed against an unforgiving iron gate, believing her story might end there in the cold and the silence. Instead, that desperate journey had led her to an entirely unexpected family, built not from blood alone, but from shared grief, hard-won truth, and a willingness to embrace forgiveness and healing even in the face of significant betrayal and doubt. She thought of Nathaniel's unwavering kindness, Margaret's crucial testimony, and even Edmund's eventual redemption, each piece coming together to form a family far richer and more resilient than she could have ever imagined during those darkest hours. Nathaniel joined her quietly in the nursery doorway, watching with evident contentment as she gently smoothed a blanket over their sleeping child. "I have been thinking," he said softly, "that perhaps it is time we properly celebrate everything this family has overcome. A proper celebration marking not just Julian's birth, but the healing and reconciliation we have all found together." Alina smiled warmly, turning to face him fully. "I would like that very much," she said. "Though I confess, I believe we are already celebrating in the quietest and most meaningful way possible, simply by being here together as a family." Nathaniel nodded, his own expression softening with genuine peace. "Yes," he agreed. "I suppose we are." Outside, the last light of evening faded gently across the estate grounds, now green and vibrant with the fullness of early summer, a stark and welcome contrast to the harsh, unforgiving snowstorm that had first brought Alina to this place so many months earlier. Within the walls of the great house, a family finally stood united, healed by truth, strengthened by forgiveness, and bound together by a love that had proven, in the end, far more powerful than any storm, any doubt, or any fear that had ever threatened to tear them apart. The celebration Nathaniel proposed took place several weeks later, on a warm summer evening when the estate gardens were in full, fragrant bloom. He invited not only extended family members, but also the household staff who had cared so faithfully for Alina and young Julian throughout the difficult months following her arrival, insisting that their loyalty and kindness deserved recognition alongside the family's own joy. Clara was given a place of honor near the head table, her earlier friendship with Alina having grown into something the household staff now regarded with quiet pride, an example of how kindness and dignity could transcend the usual boundaries between family and service. Margaret traveled once more from her distant home, delighted to witness the joyful occasion after having played such a pivotal role in establishing the truth that made this celebration possible. Even the wider Ashford relatives, who had initially greeted news of Alina and young Julian with cautious curiosity, arrived with genuine warmth, many of them having grown fond of the young family through the months of gradual introduction and increasing familiarity. Nathaniel watched with quiet satisfaction as his grandson was passed gently from one relative to another, each person marveling at his bright eyes and easy, contented smile, so reminiscent of the son Nathaniel had never had the chance to properly know. Edmund arrived early to the celebration, assisting with preparations alongside the household staff, with an enthusiasm that surprised many who remembered his more reserved and calculating demeanor from months earlier. He had, over the recent weeks, begun taking a genuine interest in young Julian's well-being, occasionally offering to watch over the infant during quiet afternoons when Alina required rest, an offer that had initially surprised her but had gradually become a welcome and trusted arrangement between them. "You have changed a great deal since winter," Alina observed quietly, watching him carefully arrange flowers along the garden's central pathway. "I have had good reason to change," Edmund replied, glancing toward young Julian, who was being gently rocked in Nathaniel's arms nearby. "Watching this family heal, watching my uncle find peace after decades of carrying such painful, unspoken grief, it has taught me a great deal about what truly matters. I spent so many years focused on securing an inheritance that I nearly missed the far greater gift of genuine family and belonging." Alina smiled warmly at his words, genuinely moved by how far his perspective had shifted since those tense early confrontations. "I am glad you found your way to that understanding," she said. "This family is stronger for having you fully within it, Edmund. I hope you know that." As the celebration continued into the warm evening hours, lanterns were lit throughout the garden, casting a soft, golden glow across the gathered guests. Music drifted gently from a small ensemble Nathaniel had arranged, and laughter mingled easily with quiet conversation as the extended family and household staff mingled freely, united in genuine celebration of new beginnings and hard-won healing. Nathaniel eventually rose to offer a brief, heartfelt toast, his voice carrying clearly across the quieted garden as guests turned their attention toward him. "Many of you know only fragments of the story that brought us to this joyful evening," he began. "A story that began, quite literally, with a desperate woman collapsed in the snow outside my gate, carrying nothing but a fading hope and an old, tarnished locket. That woman, Alina, brought with her not only proof of a son I never knew I had, but also the priceless gift of my grandson, young Julian, who now carries forward a legacy that very nearly remained lost forever to secrecy and fear." He paused, glancing warmly toward Alina, who felt tears gathering once again at his heartfelt words. "I have learned a great deal this past year," he continued, "about the dangers of allowing fear and rigid expectation to dictate matters of the heart, and about the profound healing that becomes possible when we finally choose truth and forgiveness over pride and doubt. I am endlessly grateful to Alina for her courage, to Margaret for her loyalty and truth, and yes, even to Edmund, for finding his way back to the kind of genuine character I always believed he possessed, even during our most difficult confrontations. He raised his glass higher, his voice growing steadier with quiet, joyful confidence. "To family," he said simply, "in all its complicated, imperfect, and ultimately beautiful forms, and to young Julian, who represents not an ending but a new and hopeful beginning for us all." The garden erupted into warm applause and gentle laughter, glasses raised in unified celebration, as young Julian, startled briefly by the sudden noise, quickly settled back into contented sleep within his grandfather's steady, loving arms. Later that evening, as the celebration gradually wound down and guests began their departures, Alina found a quiet moment alone with Nathaniel near the garden's edge, watching the last of the lanterns flicker gently in the warm summer breeze. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you have given us. I never could have imagined, during those darkest hours in the snow, that such profound joy and security awaited us on the other side of that desperate night." "It is I who should thank you," Nathaniel replied gently. "You brought me a truth I had long ago given up hope of ever discovering, and with it, a family I never believed I would have the privilege of knowing. Whatever gratitude you feel toward me pales in comparison to what I feel toward you and young Julian, for restoring meaning and purpose to a life that had grown quiet and solitary long before your arrival." They stood together in comfortable, contented silence for a while longer, watching the stars gradually emerge across the clear summer sky, the storm and uncertainty of that harsh winter night now feeling impossibly distant against the warmth and security of their present circumstances. As the last guests finally departed and the estate settled into peaceful nighttime quiet, Alina carried her sleeping son upstairs toward the nursery, pausing briefly at the window to look out over the moonlit gardens below. She thought once more of Julian, of Isabel, of the painful years of separation and secrecy that had ultimately given way to this hard, one moment of joyful reunion and healing. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever uncertainties the future might bring, Alina understood now, with complete and unshakable certainty, that she and her son would never again face such trials alone. They had found, against every desperate expectation of that snowstorm night, an entire family willing to embrace them fully, protect them completely, and love them without reservation or condition. It was, she thought softly, settling young Julian gently into his crib, precisely the kind of ending Julian himself would have wanted for the child he never had the chance to meet. A beginning built not on tragedy and loss, but on truth, forgiveness, and the enduring, unbreakable power of family finally reunited. 5 years passed at the Ashford estate, each one bringing new growth, new laughter, and new memories that gradually filled the once quiet halls with a warmth Nathaniel had never believed possible during the long, solitary decades before Alina's arrival. Young Julian, now a bright and curious child with his father's gentle humor and his grandmother Isabel's warm, knowing smile, had become the undeniable heart of the household, filling every corner of the estate with an energy that even the oldest household staff admitted they had never witnessed within those walls before. Nathaniel had taken to his role as grandfather with a devotion that surprised even himself, spending countless afternoons teaching young Julian about the estate's history, walking him through the same portrait-lined corridors he had once shown Alina during her earliest days there, sharing stories not only of distant ancestors, but increasingly of Julian's own father and grandmother, ensuring that the boy grew up with a full and honest understanding of exactly where he came from. "Tell me again about the locket," young Julian would often request, settling comfortably beside his grandfather near the study's warm fireplace, and Nathaniel would happily retrieve the small, tarnished silver piece from its place of honor within his desk drawer, retelling the story of Isabel's portrait and the love that had endured despite decades of forced separation. It had become something of a cherished ritual between them, one that Nathaniel treasured deeply, grateful for the opportunity to pass down a history he had once feared would remain forever hidden and unspoken. Alina, meanwhile, had grown fully into her role within the family and the wider community surrounding the estate. She had taken a particular interest in supporting local families facing hardship, remembering vividly her own desperate circumstances during that harsh winter years earlier, and using her newfound position and resources to establish a small charitable fund dedicated to assisting widows and struggling mothers throughout the county. It had become a source of great personal pride and purpose for her, a way of transforming her own painful experience into meaningful support for others facing similarly difficult circumstances. Edmund, too, had found his own renewed sense of purpose within the family, his relationship with Alina and young Julian having deepened over the years into a genuine and affectionate bond that neither of them could have predicted during those tense, early confrontations. He had taken on increasing responsibility for managing the estate's practical affairs, a role that suited his natural talents far better than the anxious, calculating ambition that had once consumed him. And he often joked, with a warmth that reflected how thoroughly his character had evolved, that he had found far greater satisfaction serving as young Julian's favorite uncle than he ever would have found as a distant, solitary heir. "Uncle Edmund taught me how to fish today," young Julian announced proudly one summer evening, presenting a small, unimpressive catch to his grandfather and mother with evident delight. "He says next time we will catch something big enough for supper." "Is that so?" Nathaniel replied, exchanging an amused glance with Alina as Edmund entered the room shortly after, looking considerably more disheveled than usual, but wearing an expression of genuine contentment that had become increasingly common over the recent years. "He has quite a natural talent," Edmund said, ruffling young Julian's hair affectionately. "Give him a few more years, and he will be teaching me a thing or two, I suspect." These small, joyful moments had become the fabric of daily life within the Ashford household, each one a quiet testament to how completely the family had healed since that desperate winter night when Alina first arrived at the estate's gate, carrying nothing but fear, grief, and a fragile, uncertain hope. Margaret continued to visit regularly throughout the years, her bond with the family only deepening as young Julian grew old enough to fully appreciate the stories she shared of his grandmother Isabel, stories that painted a vivid, loving portrait of a woman he would never have the chance to meet in person, but whose memory remained vibrantly alive through Margaret's careful, devoted storytelling. "She would be so proud of you," Margaret told young Julian during one such visit, watching him practice his reading beneath the same portrait of Isabel that Nathaniel had once shown Alina during those early, uncertain days. "You carry her strength and her kindness in everything you do." Young Julian, still too young to fully grasp the profound weight of such words, simply smiled and returned to his reading, though Alina, watching from nearby, felt a familiar warmth settle over her heart, grateful once again for the remarkable journey that had brought her family to this place of genuine peace and belonging. As young Julian approached his 6th birthday, Nathaniel began quietly preparing him for the eventual responsibilities he would one day inherit, careful to balance these lessons with the joyful freedom of childhood, unwilling to burden the boy prematurely with the weight of expectations that had once caused so much pain within the family's history. "There is no need to rush toward the future," Nathaniel often reminded himself, watching young Julian chase butterflies across the estate's expansive gardens with unrestrained joy. "He has his whole life ahead of him to grow into his responsibilities. For now, let him simply be a child, loved and secure in exactly who he is." It was a philosophy that guided the entire household's approach to raising young Julian, ensuring that despite the significant legacy he would eventually inherit, his childhood remained filled primarily with laughter, curiosity, and the steady, unwavering love of a family that had fought hard to secure his rightful place within it. On quiet evenings, once young Julian had been settled into bed, Alina and Nathaniel often found themselves reflecting on how dramatically their lives had transformed since that fateful winter night. They spoke frequently of Julian and Isabel, keeping their memories alive not through sorrow, but through genuine celebration of the love and legacy they had left behind, a legacy that continued to flourish through the child they had never had the chance to fully know themselves. "I sometimes wonder," Alina admitted one such evening, What our lives might have looked like had that storm never forced me to your gate. I wonder if Julian's family would have eventually softened, if we might have found some other path forward without ever discovering the truth of his parentage. Perhaps, Nathaniel replied thoughtfully, though I have come to believe that some truths find their way to the surface eventually, regardless of the obstacles placed before them. I am simply grateful that truth arrived in time for us to build the life we now share, rather than remaining buried forever beneath decades of unnecessary secrecy and fear. Alina nodded in quiet agreement, watching the gentle flicker of the fireplace's flames dance across the room's familiar, comfortable furnishings. The estate that had once seemed so intimidating and unfamiliar during her first desperate arrival now felt entirely like home, filled with genuine warmth, laughter, and the steady, unwavering love of a family that had proven, time and again, capable of overcoming even the most difficult and painful circumstances. As the years continued to unfold, the story of the pregnant widow who had once collapsed in the snow outside the Duke's gate slowly transformed, within the local community, into something of a quiet legend, a story often shared among those who valued tales of resilience, truth, and the healing power of forgiveness. Few who heard the story in later years could have predicted, from its desperate and uncertain beginning, just how completely joy and belonging would ultimately triumph over the fear and secrecy that had once threatened to keep an entire family apart forever. And within the walls of the Ashford estate, as another peaceful evening settled gently over gardens now green and thriving with new life, Nathaniel, Alina, Edmund, and young Julian continued to build, day by day, a family legacy defined not by the painful secrets of the past, but by the enduring warmth, honesty, and unconditional love that had ultimately brought them all safely home. Every winter, when the first heavy snow began to fall across the estate grounds, Alina made a quiet habit of walking to the same iron gate where her journey with this family had truly begun. She would stand there for a few peaceful moments, remembering the desperation and fear of that long-ago night, marveling at how completely her circumstances had transformed since then. It was never a visit filled with sorrow, but rather one of quiet gratitude, a personal ritual honoring both the hardship she had survived and the profound blessings that had followed it. Young Julian eventually began joining her on these winter walks as he grew older, curious about the significance of the weathered gate his mother visited so faithfully each year. When he was old enough to understand the full story of his family's history, Alina finally shared with him every detail, from the desperate snowstorm journey to the quiet, healing years that had followed, careful to emphasize not the fear and uncertainty of those early days, but the courage, forgiveness, and enduring love that had ultimately defined his family's story. "You survived something very difficult to bring me here," young Julian said thoughtfully, holding his mother's hand as they stood together beside the gate one crisp winter afternoon, snow beginning to fall gently around them. "We survived it together," Alina replied gently, smiling down at her son with the same warmth and love that had carried her through every difficult moment of that transformative winter years earlier. "You, your father, your grandmother Isabel, all of you gave me the strength to keep going, even when I could not fully see the path ahead." Nathaniel, watching quietly from a nearby window as mother and son stood together beside the gate, felt his own heart swell with the same profound gratitude that had defined so much of his life since that fateful night. He thought often of Julian and Isabel, wishing they could witness firsthand the beautiful, resilient family their love had ultimately created, though he found comfort in believing that perhaps, in some quiet and meaningful way, they already did. As the seasons continued their gentle, familiar cycle across the Ashford estate, the family that had been forged through hardship, truth, and unwavering love continued to flourish, their story serving as a lasting testament to the idea that even the coldest, most desperate circumstances can ultimately give way to warmth, healing, and belonging, provided there remains, within even the darkest moments, a small and steady flame of hope refusing to be extinguished. And so, within the walls of a grand estate that had once nearly turned away a desperate widow and her unborn child, a family finally found the peace, security, an unconditional love that had eluded them for far too long. Their story standing as a quiet but powerful reminder that truth, once uncovered, has the power to heal even the deepest and most painful wounds of the past.